I was on my way to the edge of nowhere when I first laid eyes on the station. It lingered in the void like a discarded object, an ugly, boxy thing bolted together. The organization had given it a generic name, Research Facility Alpha 3, but that was a joke. It was a holding cell for people like me, scientists with skills but no principles, engineers who would sell their loyalty for a chance to be out of reach. Out here, they didn't have to worry about watchdogs or whistleblowers. The shuttle docked, and I felt a wave of nausea creep up as I unstrapped from my seat. The pilot hadn't said a word the whole trip, and I figured he knew about as much as I did, which was almost nothing. I hauled myself through the airlock. There were no windows, just metal walls and corridors that seemed to go on endlessly. The first person I saw was a security officer, a stocky guy with a shaved head and a stare that made it clear he didn't care who I was or why I was here. He waved me through with a grunt, not bothering with formalities. Fine by me. I wasn't here to make friends. The rest of the crew was as grey and featureless as the station itself. They all had the same look, like they'd been here too long and forgotten why they'd come. I didn't see any familiar faces, and that was probably intentional. They didn't want us talking about the past. I was shown to my quarters, a cramped room with a bunk, a desk, and a small screen built into the wall. No personal messages, no entertainment, just the basics. They weren't here to make me comfortable. I unpacked the few things I'd brought: clothes, a battered notebook, an old photograph I kept for reasons I didn't care to examine too closely. Then I sat on the bunk and waited for the summons. The director, a woman with iron-grey hair and a permanent scowl, briefed me in a windowless office that smelled of disinfectant. "Your job is simple," she said, sliding a file across the desk. "We need a human clone, fully functional, physically stable, and capable of accelerated growth." "And the ethics?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She didn't bother responding, just looked at me like I was wasting her time. I glanced over the file. The organization had been trying to crack human cloning for years, but their previous attempts had all ended in failure. Unstable cells, rapid degeneration, complete psychotic breaks. They'd brought me in because I'd done it before, or at least come close. Close enough to know that success wasn't as simple as replicating DNA. There were other factors, things they didn't teach you in textbooks. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. I didn't need to be reminded why I'd taken this job. There wasn't a lab on Earth that would let me near their equipment after the last incident, and I wasn't interested in spending my life teaching at some third-rate university. This was my chance to get back in the game, and I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers. The director stood up, signaling that the briefing was over. "You'll start tomorrow. You have the station's resources at your disposal. But remember, Dr. Ward, this is a controlled environment. We're not here to answer questions, we're here to make progress." I walked out of her office, the weight of the file in my hand and a hollow feeling in my gut. Progress. That was what they called it. I'd seen the bodies left behind by progress, and I knew there'd be more before we were done. The lab was cold, a frigid sterility that made my skin prickle under the fluorescent lights. Massive cylinders filled with nutrient-rich fluid occupied the space, each cloning tank waiting to host a new attempt. I could see the failed prototypes floating in a containment unit nearby, misshapen things that barely resembled human beings. I'd seen worse, but there was something about the way they drifted, limp and half-formed, that made me uneasy. My team was small, just 3 other scientists who barely spoke to me beyond what was necessary. There was Harper, a genetic engineer who looked like he hadn't slept in a year. Singh, a biochemist who spent more time staring at her data than talking to anyone. And Lewis, a medical technician who moved with the resigned efficiency of a man who knew he was just here to clean up the mess. They were good at what they did, but they had the same look as the rest of the crew. I wondered what had brought them here, what they'd left behind. We started the process the way I'd done it a dozen times before, preparing the DNA samples, running tests, and calibrating the tanks. I barely spoke, focusing on the work, moving through the steps as if by muscle memory. The initial stages went smoothly. We'd prepped half a dozen samples, knowing most would fail. But this time, I had a strange feeling in my gut, like something was off even before we began. The first 3 samples were disasters. One never even began cellular division, and 2 others collapsed into mush within hours. Singh ran the data, muttering to herself in frustration, and Harper scribbled notes on his tablet. I glanced at the clock. We'd been at it for hours, and there was a weight settling in me, the kind that comes from too many late nights and too many failures. Then, on the 4th try, something changed. The cells began to divide in a way that felt purposeful. I watched as they replicated, forming clusters, then tissues, then the beginnings of organs. By the end of the day, we had a viable embryo. By the end of the week, it had developed into something more. The clone grew fast. Within days, it had formed a skeletal structure, muscles, a nervous system. It should have been weeks, but the cells seemed to hunger for growth, expanding at a rate that defied explanation. Harper was beside himself, muttering about cellular anomalies and metabolic rates, but I just watched, silent. The others noticed it too. Singh kept her distance, her eyes flicking toward the tank every so often, like she expected it to burst. Lewis looked at me once, a question in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. We were all too wrapped up in the process, too afraid to admit that something was wrong. By the 10th day, the clone looked like a person. A man, mid-30s, close enough to pass for human if you didn't look too closely. But there was something in his face, a tension in the way his muscles moved, that stirred a sense of alarm within me. He watched us through the glass, his eyes too sharp, too aware. It felt like he was studying us, measuring us like we were specimens under a microscope. The clone moved within his tank, his eyes fixed on me with a calm intensity. He raised a hand, pressed it against the glass, and I had the strangest sense that he knew exactly what he was doing, that he was waiting for something. Then he smiled, just a slight curl of the lips. This wasn't normal. I'd seen clones before, watched them go through the motions, learning to walk, to speak, to think. But this one, it was different. It felt like he'd skipped steps, like he already knew things he shouldn't. I went to the director, laid it all out, every strange detail, every unsettling behavior. She listened, her face unreadable, and then she shrugged. "It's a success, Dr. Ward. That's all that matters. Keep him contained, keep him monitored. We don't need to know why it's different. We just need it to work." The clone's development shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I'd seen rapid growth before. Hell, I'd engineered it. But this was different. By the time we reached the 15th day, he was walking, talking, even making jokes, although they were flat. I felt like I was talking to a shadow of a person, something mimicking human behavior but empty inside. The changes were subtle at first. He had a routine, just like we'd programmed. Eat, exercise, sleep. The way he went through those motions was unsettling, like he was checking off boxes. He'd sit in the corner of his room, watching us through the glass. And every time I walked by, his eyes would lock onto mine, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking. One day, as I was running a diagnostic, Harper came over, his eyes darting between me and the clone. You've seen it, right? The way it looks at us, like it's, knows us. I nodded, looking at the screen in front of me. He's different. We knew that from the start, but it's more than that. He's picking up things faster than he should. He learned the entire station's layout in 2 days. He knows where every exit is, every blind spot. Harper shifted uncomfortably. "You think it's a problem?" "It's definitely a problem," I said. "He's not supposed to have access to that kind of information. He's not supposed to have access to half of what he knows." That night, I accessed the clone's logs, looking for any sign of anomalies. He shouldn't have had memories, not in the way we do. But there were gaps, places where his brain activity spiked, like he was recalling something, The data didn't make sense. Brainwaves we'd expect to see in someone with years of experience, not a creature that had existed for less than a month. The next morning, I walked into the lab to find the clone sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at his hands. He glanced up as I approached, his face impassive, and then he spoke. "Dr. Ward, why am I here?" The question caught me off guard. We hadn't programmed him with self-awareness, not to this extent. "You're here because you were created for a purpose," I said, choosing my words carefully, "to help us understand human biology." He tilted his head, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "So, I'm a tool. An experiment." I didn't answer. He knew as well as I did what he was, and yet there was a depth to his gaze that made me uneasy. "What happens when the experiment is over?" he asked, still watching me with that unnerving calm. I forced myself to meet his eyes. "We evaluate the results, and then we decide the next steps." He gave a slight nod, as if he'd expected that answer. "And what if I don't agree with those steps?" I felt a chill, a creeping realization that I was no longer in control. "That's not your decision to make," I said, keeping my voice steady. He didn't reply, just kept watching me with a look that suggested he'd already moved on to a different line of thought. I left the room, struggling to rid myself of the feeling that he was playing some game I didn't understand. The following days brought more changes. Physically, he was diverging from human norms in ways I couldn't explain. His muscle density was increasing, his reflexes sharpening. Harper ran a few tests, and the results were troubling. His cellular structure was evolving in ways that challenged everything we understood about biology. One night, I was in my quarters, reviewing data, when the door opened. Singh stood there, a nervous energy in her eyes. "You need to see this," she said, motioning for me to follow. She led me to the observation room, where the clone was pacing, his movements smooth and unhurried. Singh brought up a screen, displaying footage from earlier that day. In it, the clone was running through a series of exercises, faster and with more precision than should have been possible. "It's like he's training for something," Singh said. "He's learning how to use his body, testing his limits." I watched the footage in silence. The clone wasn't just evolving, he was preparing. For what, I didn't know, but the implications were enough to put me on edge. The next day, I tried to talk to the director again. I laid out everything we'd observed, the rapid development, the knowledge he shouldn't have, the physical changes. She listened, and then gave me the same line she'd used before. "It's a success, Dr. Ward. That's all that matters." I felt the frustration building, but I kept it in check. "This isn't about success. He's different. He's something else." She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands on the desk. "Are you suggesting we terminate the project?" Part of me wanted to say yes, to put an end to this before it spiraled out of control. But there was another part of me, the scientist that was fascinated, that needed to know where this would lead. I was playing with fire, and I knew it. "No," I said finally. "I just think we need to be careful." She gave a curt nod, dismissing me with a glance. "Noted, Dr. Ward, but remember, our priority is results, not your concerns." Back in the lab, I watched as the clone continued his exercises, moving with a fluidity that bordered on the unnatural. I felt like I was watching something from another world, a creature that only wore the shape of a man. He caught me watching, and for a moment our eyes met. There was no fear in his look, no hesitation, just a cold awareness. He was learning not just about his surroundings, but about us. He knew we were afraid, and I had a feeling he was waiting for something. A moment, a weakness, an opportunity to break free, and I knew deep down that if he did, there would be no stopping him. Things began to unravel faster than I could keep up. The clone, he started calling himself Mason, was gone. One moment, he was in his containment room, pacing like he usually did, and the next, He'd vanished. The security feed showed nothing. One frame he was there, the next, the room was empty. The alarms triggered as soon as the system registered his absence. My heart raced as I made my way to the director's office, pushing past the few crew members who'd gathered in confusion. The director was already watching the footage in disbelief. "This shouldn't be possible," she said, barely glancing up as I entered. "He was under constant surveillance. How did he get out?" I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. "I don't know. He must have found a way around the system, but there's no way he could have done it alone. Someone had to have helped him." She fixed me with a hard stare. "Are you saying we have a traitor on board? Or are you trying to cover up your own failures, Dr. Ward?" "I'm saying he's capable of things we didn't anticipate. We need to find him before he jeopardizes the entire station. He could be anywhere by now." The director's expression darkened. "Then what are you waiting for? Go find him. And, Dr. Ward, if you can't handle this, I'll find someone who can." I didn't need to be told twice. I stormed out of her office and made my way to the lab, thinking through every possible scenario. This wasn't an experiment gone wrong. It was a full-blown crisis. Mason had somehow bypassed every security measure we'd put in place, and if he could do that, there was no telling what else he was capable of. We split into search teams, scouring the station from top to bottom. But it was as if he'd melted into the walls. Singh was shaking when I found her, staring at an empty corridor. "I saw him," she whispered. "He was just standing there, watching me. And then he was gone." It didn't make any sense. There were no dead zones, no places he could hide for long without being detected. Yet somehow he was evading us at every turn. I checked every log, every security feed, but he was a ghost. One step ahead, always just out of reach. Later that night, long after the others had given up and retreated to their quarters, I returned to the lab to review the footage one last time. That's when I heard a shuffle, like someone shifting their weight. I turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his face shrouded in the low light. "Mason," I breathed, barely able to keep my voice calm. "How did you get out?" He stepped into the room, his movements almost leisurely. "It wasn't difficult," he replied. "You underestimated me. This ends now. You're putting everyone on this station at risk." He tilted his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "Risk? I think you misunderstand, Dr. Ward. I'm not a risk. I'm the result. You wanted to create something beyond human, didn't you? Well, here I am." His words hit me like a slap. He wasn't just aware, he understood everything. He knew exactly what he was, and he seemed to revel in it. I clenched my fists, trying to mask my fear with anger. "I created you. I can end you just as easily." Mason laughed softly, an unsettling sound that filled the space. "You wouldn't know where to begin." I felt a surge of helplessness, the realization settling in that I had no idea what I was dealing with. He was no longer a clone, no longer something I could control or contain. He was something I'd unleashed without understanding the consequences. "What do you want, Mason?" I demanded. "What's the point of this?" He studied me for a moment. "I want what you want, Dr. Ward. To understand, to explore, but I won't be confined by your limits." And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. I blinked, scanning the room, but there was no sign of him. I stumbled out into the corridor, but the silence was absolute. No alarms, no footsteps. Just the emptiness of a station that had lost control of its most dangerous inhabitant. We spent the next day combing through the station, but Mason had vanished. It was as if he'd melted into the walls again, slipping through our grasp like smoke. The crew was on edge, jumping at every shadow, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. I could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that they were prey in their own habitat. The director pulled me aside at one point in fury and desperation. "This is your mess, Dr. Ward. You'd better find a way to clean it up. or I'll have you scrubbing floors on a decommissioned freighter for the rest of your miserable life." I nodded, too numb to argue. I knew she was right. This was my mess, my responsibility, and there was no one else to blame. I'd pushed the limits, crossed lines I shouldn't have. That night I found myself in the observation room, staring at the empty containment cell that had once held Mason. I'd thought I could control him, mold him into something useful, something that would prove my theories right. But he'd outgrown all of that. He'd outgrown me. I knew that if we didn't find Mason soon, he'd make his move, and we'd be powerless to stop him. The only question left was whether I'd be able to live with the consequences when it was all over. I spent hours scouring the station, tracing the places Mason had been, but he was always one step ahead. It felt like he was toying with us, slipping through our fingers just as we got close. The frustration, the fear, it was eating away at me, driving me to the brink. I could feel the tension radiating from the crew, each of us reduced to a bundle of nerves, jumping at every creak and groan of the station's frame. Then, in the early hours of what passed for morning on this station, I received the alert. The emergency pod bay, someone was preparing for launch. I ran, my footsteps pounding through the deserted halls, the adrenaline sharp and cold in my veins. I arrived just in time to see him through the reinforced glass, his form silhouetted against the lights of the pod bay. "Mason!" I shouted, slamming my fist against the glass. He turned, calm as ever. There was a faint, almost serene smile on his lips, as if he'd been expecting me all along. "It's over," he said, his voice coming through the intercom. "You can't stop this." I pressed the override controls, desperately trying to lock down the bay, but the system flashed a denial. He'd already locked me out. "Why, Mason?" I demanded, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Why are you doing this? You're putting everything, everyone, at risk. You don't understand what's out there." He turned his head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made me feel like I was the one under the microscope. "Dr. Ward, you of all people should know that I wasn't made to be confined. You didn't create me to watch me wither in a cell. You're not ready. Whatever you think you know, you're just a clone." Mason laughed softly, shaking his head. "A clone? That's what you think I am?" He took a step closer to the glass, his stare piercing through me. "You gave me more than you realized. I know things, Dr. Ward, things you can't even imagine. And I assure you, I have no intention of harming anyone." The way he said it, so calm, so assured, it chilled me to the bone. "How can I believe you?" I asked, barely able to keep the desperation out of my voice. "You've been lying from the start, manipulating us. You've been a threat since the moment you escaped." He paused, considering my words, and then he shrugged, a gesture so human it almost hurt to see. "Believe what you want, Dr. Ward. But I have no quarrel with you or with the people on this station. I simply need to know who I am and what's out there. I can't do that here." I felt the anger boiling up again, mingling with the fear, twisting into something ugly. "You can't just leave. You're not human. You don't belong out there." He smiled again, that infuriating smile. "Maybe not, but what I am, Dr. Ward, isn't confined by your definitions. You created me to explore possibilities. Well, now I'm going to do exactly that." The emergency pod bay door opened, and he stepped inside, his movements confident. I slammed my fist against the console, trying to initiate a shutdown, but every system was locked. He'd planned this, every last detail, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. "Mason!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "You can't go. You don't know what's out there. You're risking everything. If you leave, there's no coming back." He turned to face me one last time. "You fear what you don't understand. But I have no ill will, Dr. Ward. I'm not your enemy." And then he was gone, the pod sealing shut with a quiet finality. I watched, helpless, as the airlock cycled, and the pod detached, drifting free of the station. I ran to the nearest viewport, my breath fogging the glass as I watched the tiny vessel disappear into the blackness of space. He was gone, leaving nothing but questions. As the last traces of the pod faded from view, I felt the emptiness closing in. Mason had escaped, and I had no idea what he intended to do, what he might become. He'd assured me he meant no harm, but was he telling the truth, or was he merely biding his time? Back in the lab, I pulled up the logs, reviewing every trace of data he'd left behind. There were gaps, empty spaces where files should have been. He'd erased parts of himself, hidden pieces of his knowledge that I'd never get back. I wondered what secrets he'd taken with him, what pieces of himself he'd left behind, scattered like breadcrumbs through the station's systems. The director called shortly after, demanding an explanation. I gave her the facts, as cold and clinical as I could manage. Mason had escaped. He was beyond our reach. She didn't say much, just a terse acknowledgement before cutting the connection. I knew what would come next. The station would be shut down, the project erased, and I'd be left to bear the weight of my own failures. As I sat there, alone in the empty lab, the realization settled over me. I'd unleashed something into the universe, something I couldn't understand or control. Mason was out there now, drifting through the void with all the knowledge I'd given him, and perhaps much more. I wondered if I'd ever hear of him again, if he'd leave a trace somewhere, a sign that he was still out there, exploring, learning, growing. And then I wondered if I even wanted to know. It's been 5 years since I left the station. 5 years since I watched Mason disappear into the blackness of space, carrying with him the knowledge I gave him, and whatever else he'd gleaned on his own. I've tried to move on. I took a position as a research consultant miles from any lab, with nothing more challenging than theoretical models and safety protocols. The organization kept their word. There were no inquiries, no consequences, and as far as the rest of the world is concerned, the project never existed. But I never stopped wondering. In the quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts, I think about Mason, drifting somewhere out there. Sometimes I catch myself scanning the news feeds, hoping and fearing that his name will appear, that there'll be some trace of him. So far, nothing concrete, but I've picked up on whispers, fragments of information that only someone like me would understand. The rumors come from the fringes of society, the places where people still care about the unexplained and the impossible. A few months ago, I heard something that shook me. A contact in the outer colonies sent me a message, encrypted and vague, the kind of thing you'd ignore unless you knew exactly what to look for. It mentioned sightings, a man who possessed knowledge of technologies beyond anything the colonies had developed. He appeared sporadically in obscure locations, offering insights that could only come from someone with a deep understanding of life beyond our reach. The contact didn't know much, but the description was enough. He's not quite human, they'd said. Almost like us, but different. He knows things he shouldn't. I'd stared at that message for a long time. I didn't reply. There was no point. If it was Mason, there was nothing I could do about it. And if it wasn't, well, the alternative was too terrifying to consider. Since then, other rumors have surfaced. Talk of a man who walks through secure facilities as if they're open doors, who understands languages no one's spoken in centuries. I've heard about small colonies suddenly advancing in technology, reaching breakthroughs that should have taken them decades. A part of me hopes it's not him, that somehow these are just coincidences, unrelated anomalies. But I know better. Deep down, I know it's him. People are calling him a myth, a legend, the kind of story told by pilots and drifters to pass the time on long voyages. They say he's searching for something, some answer that only he can understand. They say he's trying to find his place in a universe that wasn't made for him. And then, there are the darker rumors, the ones I try to ignore. Whispers of entire settlements abandoned, of people who encountered him and were never the same. I don't want to believe those stories, but they eat at me, burrowing into my thoughts late at night. I remember the way he looked at me, the cold certainty in his eyes as he left, and I wonder if I ever really knew him at all. As for me, I've made a quiet life on a remote research station, far from Earth and even farther from the kind of experiments that led to Mason's creation. I work with other scientists now, people who have no idea what I've done, what I've seen. They think I'm just another old academic, someone content with a desk and a data screen. They don't know about the nights I lie awake, haunted by the choices I made, by the knowledge that something I created is out there, beyond my reach. Every so often I consider going after him, trying to track him down to see if I can find the answers that still elude me. But I never do. I know that if I ever saw him again, it would be the end of whatever peace I've managed to scrape together. Besides, what would I say? What would he say? Mason is beyond me now, beyond anything I can control or understand. He always was, I suppose. I just refused to see it. I try to live my life to focus on the here and now, but I know that Mason is out there, somewhere, still searching. I don't know if he remembers me, or if he even thinks of me at all, but I remember him. I remember every mistake, every step that led us to that moment in the pod bay, when he left me behind with nothing but questions. They say you can't escape your past, that it follows you like a shadow. I think Mason is mine. He's the shadow I cast, the echo of all my ambitions and failures, drifting through the void. Maybe he'll find what he's looking for. Maybe he already has, but I know this much. I'll never stop wondering, never stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when his name appears in the news, when the world learns what I've known all along. Until then, I live in the silence, in the spaces between rumors and whispers, waiting for the echo of the man I created to reach me, one way or another. And I know that when it does, it will bring with it all the fear, all the awe, and all the guilt I've tried to bury. Because the truth is, I'm not sure I created Mason at all. I think, in some way, he created me.